Title of the talk is Spanish Colonial Cobs, a Most Unlikely Collectible. And the subtitle is because these coins were never intended to be kept. They weren't even really intended to circulate for the most part. They were just intended to transport gold and silver across the Atlantic to Spain and then to be remelted and used for other things. A lot of them did circulate, but that wasn't the original intent behind these coins. So today I'm going to talk about, first of all, what is a cob, what defines a cob. We'll do a little bit of Spanish colonial American history, the purpose of cob coinage, the minting process, design elements, and then some of the reasons why I think collecting cobs is particularly interesting, at least to me. Cobs were hand-struck Spanish colonial coins minted in the Americas from the 1500s to the 1700s. The term may come from two different places. We're not exactly sure. Either the Old English word cob, which means a small irregular mass of something, or the Spanish word cabo, which refers to the end of a bar, and that's related to the way that they're minted. So I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But the defining characteristic of cobs is that they're crude. They're much cruder than other coins of the period. Again, partly because they weren't really intended to be circulating coins. They were mostly just intended to get this money across the ocean so it could be reprocessed, but also because conditions were very crude in Spanish colonial America. So it would make sense that the coins that resulted from that region would also be pretty crude.
So why didn't they just ship raw silver bullion as opposed to going to the trouble of all these small, essentially small bullion pieces?
Mm-hmm. They did that also, but the main reason was because they couldn't account for it as accurately as they needed to. Like there needed to be taxes collected at all these different steps along the way. And so the money had to be divisible in a way and they did ship a lot in bars as well. But the cobs were the divisible portion of the coinage that they created. So anyway, Spanish colonial cobs come in silver and gold, silver reales, gold escudos, denominations of 8, 4, 2, and 1, sometimes half, depending on the period, only in silver. And the 8 real and escudo coins were 27.468 grams, or usually a little bit less than that. Sometimes quite a bit less than that, and somewhere between 0.9 and 0.93 fine, also depending on the period. So in this talk, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the 8 real coins. For the most part, the smaller denominations are just smaller versions of the 8 real coins, more abbreviated legends, but they're just harder to see, harder to read. So I'm going to focus on the big ones. Spanish colonial history is complicated. I'm just going to touch on a few things here. The point of this slide is just to illustrate how quickly the Spanish conquered Central America. In the space of 20 years, they had conquered, destroyed most of the civilizations in the Americas that were substantial. So within 50 years after Columbus discovered the Americas, the Spanish had subjugated that entire yellow portion of North and South America. By the mid-18th century, their empire was 25 times the size of Spain, 13% of the Earth's land area. So it's just an amazingly fast conquering. And then it was pretty quick that they were starting to extract wealth from all of this area that they had recently conquered. So this we kind of touched on already. The main purpose of cobs was to have an accounting system for all this gold and silver that was flowing across the Atlantic during this time, and so that the king could collect his 20% tax on everything. So just for a little bit of context, in 1492, there were approximately 88 tons of gold in Europe. I have no idea how somebody figured that out, but I read that in a book, and so there you go. In the 150 years, from 1500 to 1650, the Spanish shipped 181 tons of gold from the Americas to Europe. So tripling the amount of gold that was there just in that time period. And then silver, the 300 years, from 1500 to 1800, 150,000 tons of silver, which was 80% of the world production of silver during that time period. To transport all this gold and silver, the Spanish had treasure fleets almost every year from 1566 to 1790. And these fleets would arrive from Spain and the Caribbean, usually in the spring. They would split. The terra firma fleet, it's hard to read here, but one fleet would go down here to Cartagena and collect gold and silver from South America. The other fleet would go across to Veracruz in Mexico, collect items from Mexico and also goods that had been shipped across the Pacific to Acapulco, which is right there, traveled overland to Veracruz and loaded on the ships there. And then these two fleets would try to reunite in Havana before the hurricane season every year and sail back to Spain. And as you can imagine, there were often delays. They very often didn't leave on time, and they wound up in the middle of hurricane season, and that's why we have so many shipwrecks all around Florida and the eastern U.S., the southeastern U.S. It's just dozens of shipwrecks of this period.
And the pirates are part of the Phoenix.
Pirates, yeah, they were definitely, these flotillas were attacked by pirates. They were attacked by British and French naval ships, but probably the hurricanes did the most damage in terms of lost income for Spain. So moving on to the minting process, this is where we get to the term cabo, end of a bar. To mint these coins, they forged long, narrow bars of gold or silver, and then they would slice the planchets off the end of the bar. And then those planchets were roughly hammered into shape, trimmed down to the correct weight, and then struck between obverse and reverse dies, all done completely by hand. You get really irregular shapes resulting from the shape of that bar and the hammering that was done to get the coins relatively flat. This is actually a fairly round one as far as cobs go. You also have uneven thicknesses, so you often have flat areas on the coins where the image doesn't show. You have issues with the hardness of the metal being inconsistent, so sometimes you get cracks and splits in the coins. You get multiple strikes. This one you can see there's supposed to be one ring of dots here, and you can see there's one ring and then another ring kind of next to it. That's an example of doubling. It's really, really common. Sometimes you'll even have doubling with a 90-degree rotation, and then centering as well. You can see that, obviously this cross is way off center, very common in cob coins. So in contrast to that, they did also make royals, which were presentation grade coins, basically the highest quality they could make at the time. These often used custom-made dies, very carefully prepared planchets, and they got the whole impression on the coin. These are very rare. The term royals comes from the idea that they might have been presented to royalty, but we don't really know. They often have holes in them, so they were clearly like worn or not intended for use as currency. The holes weren't put in at the mint, I don't think, but they were, at least half of them that we find now are holed. So they were worn around the neck by somebody at some point. Yeah, just the same way that other coins are holed, but it's really common with royals. People didn't save cobs for the most part, except for the royals. Most of the ones that we have these days came from shipwrecks. The mints in the Spanish colonies, they had quite a few of them. The big three are Mexico City, Lima, and Potosi. Each of those operated for about 200 years. Today we're really just going to talk about coins from the Mexico City Mint and the Potosi Mint. Those created by far the greatest number of silver coins especially. Lima produced a lot of gold, and then all the other mints produced, maybe 2 or 3% of the total cob production. So much more complicated to talk about cobs if we talk about all those mints as well, but we're just going to focus on Mexico and Potosi for now. So moving on to design elements of cobs. These coins were made during the reigns of 9 kings of Spain, 3 Charleses, 4 Philips, 1 Louis, and 1 Ferdinand. Philip V served twice with Louis in between for like a year or two, and then he died. It's amazing how little change happened during that time. You really just have these 3 basic design elements, the cross, the shield, and the pillars and waves. They changed a little bit, but it was always those 3 elements throughout that entire time period. So there are 3 primary types of cobs. The first is the Charles and Joanna cobs. They have a shield on the obverse, pillars and waves on the reverse. And then the shield type has the shield on the obverse, cross on the reverse. Pillars and waves type has the cross on the obverse and the pillars and waves on the reverse. And obverse and reverse is determined in this case by where the legend begins, because the legend is continuous, like as a phrase that you would read starting with usually the name of the king, and then it goes on from there. So the obverse of the coin is where the legend begins. So these are the three main types. We're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail here. So the Charles and Joanna coins, 1536 to 1571, they were only used for 35 years. They have the shield and the mint mark. We have the mint mark, Mexico on the right, a sayer on the left. Sometimes that switched, but conveniently there were no M assayers, and these were only made in Mexico. So you can always tell what the assayer was and what the mint was, even though they switched them. They have the arms of Castile and Leon in the shield, the lions and the castles. And then on the reverse, we have the pillars and waves, pillars representing the Straits of Gibraltar, the pillars of Hercules, the waves down here, a little hard to see, representing the Atlantic Ocean. And then they always have this plus ultra phrase across the middle. It usually has 9 letters plus ultra. This one is missing the last A. It's common for letters to just be omitted if they didn't have space. That means more beyond. So they're saying beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, across the Atlantic Ocean, there is this land and it belongs to Spain, basically. This is a 2 real. You can see the 2 dots here. It says it's a 2 real coin. And this is actually the last slide where we're going to talk about the Charles and Joanna Cobs, because they're kind of not Cobs. They're included in many books about Cobs, but they're actually minted in a different way. These were created on flat planchets that were cut into circles and then stamped, more like normal coins of the era, as opposed to a more crude slice off of a bar. So I include them here because some people include them in the Cobb series, but we won't talk about them anymore. Okay, so this is a true Cobb, the shield type Cobb, minted from 1571 to 1734. We have the Habsburg shield on the obverse with the mint, OM, for Mexico, and the assayer, P, on the left. Denomination is 8, hard to read, but it's right there. 8 reals on the right. And then the inscription is the King of Spain, so the name of the king, in this case, this would have been Philip IV. There are actually 2 Roman numerals down here. When they did Philip IV, they didn't do IV, they did 4 I's. So this is 2 of the I's, and there might be 2 more here. It's a little hard to tell. Philip IV, Dei Gratia, which means by the grace of God. In this case, they added the date in the early 1600s. This coin has a date up here, 1656, I think. And when they added the dates, they abbreviated the Dei Gratia, so it's just Dei G, and there's a G right there at the end. You can see these coins are a bit of detective work to figure them out, which is what I really like about them. So then the reverse, we have the cross with lions and castles again, and the inscription is Rex Hispaniarum Indiarum, which is King of Spain and the Indies. So these coins stayed pretty much the same for most of that 200-year period, at least in Mexico. So then the pillars and waves coins were started in 1652, lasted for a little over 100 years. These coins have the cross with the lions and castles on the obverse. We have the mint, very hard to read, but there is a P over here. This one's kind of double struck, so it's hard to see. The mint on the left, a sayer, E on the right. We have the date at the bottom, also hard to read, but it's a 63. And usually there's a denomination on the top. I don't see it on this one, which is weird, but sometimes they just didn't get all the elements on these coins. And then on the reverse, we have a return to the pillars and waves style. It's a little bit stylized now. The waves are pretty clear here, and the pillars, and then they have these 2 horizontal lines creating a 9 quadrants. And in those quadrants, they have across the top the mint, P, the denomination, and the assayer, you can't really read. And then on this side, in the middle, plus ultra abbreviated, and then on the bottom, assayer, E, the date, 63, and then the mint again. So these coins were only used in the South American mints, so not in Mexico City. And they were developed in response to a mint scandal in the early 1600s where a lot of underweight coins were being produced and coins of not of proper purity. And the response was to put more identifying characteristics on the coin so that if more problems were discovered, they could point to which assayer it was who was causing the trouble and kill him or whatever they would do to him, but probably kill him. So these coins actually have 3 dates, 4 mint marks, 3 assayers, and 2 denominations, just to try to make sure that at least one of each of those things would show up on each coin, no matter how badly it was produced. Here are some of this slide shows the evolution of Cobs and also the differences between the Mexico City and the Potosi Cobs. So across the top are Philip II Cobs from the 1500s. You can see how they're pretty close to round. They have pretty complete impressions, and then the quality just degraded from there. So we get to Philip IV in the mid-1600s. You can see all the Cobs have become a little bit more irregular. They have more flat spots. You also see the transition from the shield type to the pillars and waves type. On the Potosi side, here's the shield type. Here's the pillars and waves type. And then by the time we get to Philip V, the Cobs are even cruder. The Mexican ones tend to be very angular, and they have facets on the sides, so that you have areas along the sides of the coin where the design is not impressed. That's really, really typical. And then the Potosi coins are really thick and chunky. They're usually at least a 1/4 inch thick, and they're just like lumps, and you only get the center of the design on the coin, which on this one, you really only have, you can see the date, and you can see an assayer, I think, over here, but there's not much else that you can actually read on that. I can see the denomination 8 right there. Another thing about these, or looking at them side by side, it's often hard to tell even which mint a coin came from, but one key to identifying the Mexican coins is the cross on the Mexican coins through the entire run of Mexican Cobs. It always has this sort of little club detail at the end of the cross. So if you see that, you know it's a Mexican Cob, and then you can go from there to trying to identify more details about it. Whereas the Potosi Cobs have various ends to the crosses, but never that particular detail. So just one little flash into the gold realm. I'm mostly talking about silver Cobs here, but just to differentiate, Potosi didn't make any gold Cobs, but Lima made a whole bunch of them for almost 100 years. And the Lima Cobs, as well as all the other South American gold Cobs, are all the pillars and waves style, whereas the Mexican ones are all the shield style. So very easy to tell at least which mint your Cob came from. And then you can see the styles are very similar to the silver, just a little bit different, especially now this is a counterpoint to the point I just made about the Mexican Cobs having that detail on the end. The gold ones did not. The gold ones had more of a South American style cross, like bar at the end of the cross. But they're easy to tell apart because they only did shield gold escudos in Mexico. That's pretty much it for the sort of technical exploration of Cobs. I just have a couple slides about why I like collecting them. I think they're extra challenging because in addition to being heavily worn, like any coin could be, they also are really poorly made to begin with. So you never know what detail you're going to have to try to look at to figure out what a coin actually is. They have a ton of character, just the odd shapes, and it's just interesting. Every one is so unique. And then by romance, that's where I'm referring to, like the shipwreck aspect, the pirates. There's just sort of a lot of story behind this time period. And then themes, there are lots of, in addition to sort of the normal collecting themes, there are other ways that you can collect Cobs that I'll talk about in a sec. So the challenge of Cobs, so the pictures that I've shown throughout most of the presentation have been better than average Cobs. This is more of a maybe slightly worse than average, but very typical, like how much you would actually get to see of the design on a Cob, especially if it's sea salvaged and has some corrosion. So on a coin like this, you'd look for a date, but there isn't one. You look for a mint mark. We actually can find a mint mark on this one. It's hard to see, but there's an M right there. You can only make out part of it, but there's an M there, which implies that it would be a Mexican Cobb. Also, the shape of it, it's a very classic Philip V Mexican Cobb because it has the faceted sides, angular shape, faceted sides. So just that alone implies it's Philip V. Also, it's hard to see, but on my computer, I can see a little better. They're kind of a club head here on the cross, which also suggests Mexican. The next thing would be to try to find the assayer, to try to narrow in the date range a little bit more. And on this one, there's a letter right here that you can't quite make out, but if we look at Philip V Cobbs, the assayer options are L, J, D, R, G, or F. And so I think the only one that makes sense is a J for that right there. So a little bit of guessing here, but I think it's a J. And that assayer, Jose Eustaquio de Leon, was working at the Mexico Mint from 1705 to 1724. So we can rein in the date to that range, probably. Also, he was one of the primary assayers for Mexican Cobbs found with the 1715 fleet, which is where the vast majority of his coins are from, which would mean it so again, we're going deeper into conjecture now, but it's likely a 1715 fleet coin because lots and lots of these came from the 1715 fleet, and a lot of them were made by assayer J, or assayed by assayer J. So if that's the case, we narrow the date range down to 1705 to 1715, because it couldn't have been made after the ship sank. And then one more detail on this coin you can use to date it even closer. You see this shield, 1713, it had a solid bar across right here. 1714, it turned into a smaller box. And if you look at this one, that detail is right here. It looks like that box is a smaller box and not a full bar. So that would date this coin at 1714 or 1715, because that's when that transition happened. So this is just an example of kind of the puzzle of figuring these coins out. Character, kind of already said it, each coin is unique, and because there's so much range just within a single coin, each collection has a lot of character, a lot of personality. The 5 coins here are all Potosi 8 real Cobbs from 1618. They're all from the wreck of the Atocha. And you can pick the one that appeals to you the most, and they're all just so different, so much more so than with modern coins anyway. The romance aspect, again, I've kind of talked about already. I just think about Spanish galleons and pirates and sunken treasure when I handle my Cobbs, and it just makes it extra fun. Very few of these coins survived in circulation. Most of them were melted down, cut up into pieces, and just spent and used and destroyed. So most of the ones that exist today actually sunk on a ship and were discovered on the ocean floor hundreds of years later. And it's just a interesting history that they have. Some of the main, most well-known shipwrecks in the Americas from this period were the Atocha, 1622, 1715 fleet, and the 1733 fleet, both along the east coast of Florida. Some of the themes, you can collect Cobbs, you can chase any theme you want. A lot of these themes are the same as themes you can chase with other types of coins as well. But some things like shipwrecks are a great example of a theme that a lot of people use to collect Cobbs. You can try to collect one Cobb from every known shipwreck that contained Cobbs, and there are only, there are a few dozen of them, but it's a manageable task. There are a few that are pretty hard, like the Widda. It's a pirate ship that was discovered, and a couple of Cobbs were found on it, and they sell for many tens of thousands of dollars whenever they come up. But most of them are pretty accessible, especially if you're willing to not go for the most rare variety or the highest condition. Those are my thoughts on Cobbs. And I brought quite a few, so I can show.
Next question?
Sure.
So I'm curious, because of the simplicity, or even in some cases crudity, is there, in the Cobb world, are there problems with, counterfeits or anything like that? Because it seems like they potentially could be easier to make than, traditional
Mhm.
later coin counterfeits.
Yeah, definitely there are counterfeits. I mean, most counterfeits are cast counterfeits as opposed to hand stamped, and so the easiest way to detect those is to notice that there are more than one of them, because otherwise, there would never be two the same otherwise. So there are lists online of known counterfeit Cobs, and you can, if you have something that you suspect, you can go there and compare it and see if you can find a match to a known cast counterfeit. If people were making stamped, like individually stamped counterfeits, that would be a lot harder to tell them apart, and so that probably is happening. I try to buy mine through reputable dealers because I don't trust myself to be able to necessarily tell. So like there are auction houses, like Daniel Frank Sedgwick is a well-known Cobb expert, and he does an auction every twice a year.
Can I look at that?
Sure. And you can also get them slabbed, but I don't think the people at the slabbing agencies know Cobbs very well, so I wouldn't necessarily trust them to tell. I trust these guys. I mean, ideally, you get one that has a photo certificate connecting it to a shipwreck, and that's the gold standard. But that very few of them actually have a photo certificate connecting to a shipwreck unless they're really valuable.